thank you to Rita for resolving our technological challenges. And welcome. Slowly gather. So it would make a lot of sense for me to introduce the construct lecture series and then introduce Stanislaus von Moos, our speaker within the series. So introduce the big thing and then the speaker. That's so logical that it goes without saying. But even if we all stereotype the Swiss as being more logical than anyone else in the world, this Swiss historian has thrown my logic off course. To his credit, he didn't throw me for a loop deliberately, but with the preface to his book, Le Corbusier, Elements of a Synthesis, which first came out in German in 1968, and then was translated and published in English in 1979. It's through this book that I first heard of Stani von Moos, and in fact, until I met him only relatively recently, it was the only image I had of him. Incredibly articulate and thorough, silver, and relatively heavy as a volume. A New English edition came out a year ago, same dimensions, but with what looks like an aubergine cover, which sheds an entirely new color onto this image of Stani von Moos. As a side note, it's one of the books that also causes a little bit of domestic friction when it comes to our library, because our library is shelved alphabetically, so it's always hard to know where this book goes. Does it go under Le Corbusier, and is that L or C, or under von Moos, and is that V or M? 7 chapters long, again a side note. Notably, the chapter titles have changed names as the book has been republished over its many editions. So, for example, The Origins of an Architectural Language of Form in 1968, one chapter, became Typology and Design Method in 1979. The book is itself synthetic. It covers everything from Le Corbusier's biography to his relationship to the arts, purism, surrealism, to philosophical and political contexts. Architecture is a generalist synthetic enterprise we repeat over and over again in this school. This book, perhaps more than any other, illustrates that point. The book is a synthesis, but it was and still remains also a springboard for Le Corbusier studies. Written in the late 1960s, before the Le Corbusier archives were made accessible, it has remained one of the touchstone studies of Le Corbusier for architectural scholars ever since. So the sentence in his preface that I want to draw your attention to is the following. To the extent that visions of the future are extrapolations of certain aspects of the present, I believe that Le Corbusier is more interesting today as a visionary of his own time than as a prophet. This sentence, written 35 years ago, pretty much summarizes the school's agenda. Our conviction that you are all visionaries, that you're all producing visions of the future that are extrapolations of certain aspects of the present. These visions are constructs, and that's what brings me back around to the theme of the semester. Construct, this semester's lecture theme, operates as much as a verb, construct, as it does as a noun, construct. Like most of our semester themes, if you haven't yet noticed, construct is another way of saying thesis. It's a way of underscoring that architecture, as opposed to building, has a construct behind it. And it's in the construction of constructs that architecture pushes back somewhat at our mental constructs. Your tasks as visionaries is to produce visions that springboard from our collective culture and your understanding of that culture, our present, rather than prophecies that have no collective traction. From 1983 to 2005, Stanislaus von Moos was Professor of Modern Art at the University of Zurich. Currently, he is a Vincent Scully Visiting Professor of Architectural History at Yale University. He's also taught at several other schools in Europe and the US. In addition to founding and editing the influential journey Architectes, Stani has created a number of important architectural exhibitions and has written books. In addition to his book on Le Corbusier, he's written books on Renaissance architecture, 20th century design history, Venturi, Max Bill. I won't go on to list the entire length of his output. His current projects involve architecture and politics in Europe around 1950, and more generally the interactions of the visual arts and architecture of the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Stani von Moos here today for his lecture, Brutalisms in History.
haven't said anything. I'm so impressed by this introduction. Thank you very much. Obviously, it doesn't make me much younger. I'm happy to know that my very old book, ancient book, made its way to Texas. Fantastic. It's the first time that I hear something about it from so far south. So thank you very much for this extremely intriguing remarks that we made. And of course, I can only fall short of the expectations that we may now have regarding my presentation. But in fact, it wasn't so obvious. Maybe it was obvious from the title that I'm going to talk about the progressive, but I am, in fact, going to talk about the progressive. I didn't, want to suggest that anybody should remember my book, but now that it has been done, we will see that what I have to present is somehow an attempt of a revision of certain things that were said in the 1960s and then said again in a slightly different form in the 90s and even in the early years of this century. Now, this would have been an possible alternative title to my this evening's presentation, a presentation that comes in 5 chapters. Now, don't think if the first chapter is a little long, all the other 5 will also be very long. I can guarantee that some will be very short and some will be, of course, a little too long, as most of these talks, unfortunately, tend to be. But the term of my first section, ruins in reverse, is a term that I borrowed from the American sculptor Robert Smithson, who in the 1960s made some photographs of the landscape around his hometown in New Jersey, where he saw banks of rubble, rusting pipes, fragments of bridges and dams and canals that were never completed, and that he called memory traces of an abandoned future. This is one of those very intriguing photographs that he made in New Jersey. Now, ruins in reverse. While a ruin, obviously, is the fragment of something that no longer exists, ruin in reverse implies something that is still in the making, but whose making has been interrupted, most often by sudden lack of money or sudden change of plan. He says, literally, ruins in reverse are the opposite of the romantic ruin, for the buildings don't fall into pieces after having been built, but they rise to the status of ruins before being built, which is very well what somehow happens here. And the subtitle of the essay where he discusses this issue of the ruin and the ruin in reverse, in the subtitle of his essay, Smithson puts it very bluntly by wondering, has Passaic, his hometown in New Jersey, replaced Rome as the eternal city? And of course, when he referred to Rome in connection with ruination, with ruins, you may have had in mind Piranesi. Here, Piranesi, not Rome, it's Pompeii, it's Paestum, but never mind. What is clear is that what we have here is literally ruins, literally the remains of buildings that once were complete buildings, actually temples in the background, the wall of the city in the foreground. But what is also clear is that in our environment globally, especially in parts of the world where the economy is not so thriving, there are probably as many ruins in reverse to be found than real ruins. Ruins in reverse, like, for instance, this construction site of the Secretariat of Chandigarh, photographed by the Swiss photographer Ernst Scheidecker in 1956. And I think that precisely the fact that this phenomenon of the ruin in reverse is such a globally relevant and familiar phenomenon, familiar sight, makes this into an extremely powerful picture, a picture that does not merely represent a moment in the construction of Chandigarh, but a condition of architecture that has an undeniable melancholic truth for our time and also an undeniable beauty and an undeniable fascination. Now, the intriguing thing is that this is not a very modern fascination. It's in fact the fascination of the Babel Tower. And speaking of the Babel Tower, I'm showing you the most obvious example from art history, namely that painting of the late 16th century by Breuchel the Elder, that shows, if you read it through the Bible, the state of the Tower of Babel after God has decided to interrupt the works there and to disperse the population on the basis of their irreverence to God's will and on the basis of their hubris. But at the same time, there are other ways of reading a painting like this, and we know even from the literature and from art history from the 15th and the 16th century that actually, even within the oeuvre of Bruegel, there are something like 3 or 4 interpretations of the Bruegel theme. One in the biblical sense, and others that suggest actually quite different meanings, such as this one, which in fact shows a ruin, but at the same time a ruin that documents a relatively thriving economic and building activity. It's actually a colossal building site, and as a colossal building site it documents nothing so much as a growing or actually economically thriving society. Not by coincidence, guilds, construction people in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century used the Babel Tower as a symbol of their trades. So I think this reading of the Babel Tower as a document of construction happening, construction going on, is an entirely appropriate reading. It's not the only possible, but it's an entirely appropriate reading of that particular painting. This intriguing, mesmerizing ambiguity of the ruin as a construction site that is, perhaps interrupted and thereby destined to become a ruin. This mesmerizing ambiguity is, in a certain sense, what my talk is about. Now, don't forget, of course, that this ambiguity of ruins, the fact that you can see them as witnesses of decay, but at the same time you can see them as building ideas in the making, that this ambiguity of ruins is something that has intrigued and preoccupied many architects. It has intrigued, of course, above all, Louis Kahn, who spoke in a very famous passage in an interview that he granted to the art historian Klotz, who spoke of a building, or of the building when it is finished. He wants to be looked at. Wants also to communicate how it was made, but the people who look at the building are not interested in how it was made because they're exclusively interested in how it works, because they read it through the function. And he says, in fact, that only when a building turns ruin, only when a building has lost its daily function for which it was built, it is capable of revealing the actual intention of the architect that has inspired it. This is what he, was one of the reasons why he was so fascinated by the ruins of Rome, ruins of Ostia that he visited when he was in Rome as a member of the American Academy in the early 1950s. And this is why some of his work obviously has this strong affinity, or reverberates with some of the things that he has seen in Rome, the Roman ruins, and that in a certain sense the works themselves, this here being the Indian Institute of Scientific Management in Ahmedabad, themselves look like interrupted building or construction sites. Here you have the same building in its construction process. Now, beyond that, and this will finish my introductory remarks, there is, of course, another subject that I would like to project upon this first brief discussion of the Babel Tower, namely the fact that there is, and Bruegel himself is a document to this, a deep affinity or sort of, let's say affinity, for lack of a better word between the media, the medium of painting, the medium of photography, the media of film, and the ruin or the building, the construction site. And I think one of the obvious examples in this connection is what actually is one of the first movies ever produced, a little 1-minute movie by the Lumiere brothers in the late 19th century, which shows nothing than the ruination of a wall. And if you look at it carefully, and at one point you will see the whole thing reverts into a building and into a construction site. So this ambivalence between something that is crumbling, the fascination of something that is crumbling, and at the same time then becomes something, the opposite, something that is being built, that is being erected. This here is the turning point. This ambivalence is something that has fascinated the media, and I don't know, obviously, I don't need to insist on the fact that what would James Bond be without ruins? What would the TV shows that we watch in the evening, what would advertising, what would the commercials be? Car commercials in particular, without incidents, without ruination, without things that are being ruined. And obviously, we all know that it's a fair chance that 1 out of 2 or 3 covers of the New York Times, this happens to be the New York Times cover of yesterday, shows a ruin. More often a ruin, really a war ruin, than a construction site, but quite often also construction sites. Now, so much for my introduction. What about architects in the years immediately after World War II? My focus, as you might have suspected from the title of this talk, is the 1940s, and the territory I'm most familiar with, this connection most interested in, is of course Europe. And in Europe, 1939, the war had just begun. Within weeks, it had disfigured some of the great cities of Europe: Warsaw, London, Rotterdam. Later in the war, when the revenge of the Allies came, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. The picture that you see here is from Berlin. Now, the quote by Alberto Savigno, with which I want to begin, may not speak for the entire profession of architects. In fact, Savigno isn't even an architect, he's a painter and a writer. Yet the quote's blatant absence of sentimentality is certainly typical of a widespread condition among architects. Quote, "I'm wandering around among the ruins of Milan," Savigno writes, a few months after Milan had been badly hit by Allied bombs. That was in the last months of World War II, 1943-44. "Why this excitement?" Savigno writes. "I'm supposed to be sad, but instead I almost explode out of joy. I should have musings about death, but instead ideas of life are striking my forehead, like the breeze of the purest and most radiating of all mornings. Why? Because I feel that new life will emerge from these ruins. I feel that a stronger, richer, more beautiful city will emerge from these ruins." Why so? Was it that Savigno had felt so joyful because those bombings, the war, was likely to come to an end? Was it that he liked the Americans and the British who were responsible for the bombings better than the Italian fascists? You may assume that there was some truth to that, but we don't really know. But we do know that a feeling of liberation, almost euphoria, in view of the bombings was absolutely widespread among architects at that time. The British were perhaps the least sentimental in their but barely veiled sense of relief. Their enthusiasm about the obvious opportunities for work represented by the first bombardments that hit them in the first months of the war, 39 1940. This is a very early ad from, taken from, I think, 1940, the Architectural Review, that gives you the sense of euphoria of the profession. Now finally, the big jobs will arrive. Another of those very beautiful ads. Now, perhaps all that should not even be so surprising, given that the very idea of modern architecture, the idea of building, to begin with, let alone the idea of building a new city, the new city, has always formed a pact with ruins, with ruination, for in order to build, one needs to demolish. I'll just give you one example that, of course, Reto is familiar with. This is a Swiss architectural avant-garde magazine of the 1920s, who in its first issues had an ad of a very famous Zurich deconstruction, demolition firm that actually sponsored that magazine for avant-garde architecture, still existing demolition firm in Zurich. Markets its brand name in connection with the promotion of contemporary avant-garde architecture. And that pact had obviously been solidified by the conviction held by modern architects that the city form of the 20th century, that the city form the 20th century had inherited from the 19th was fundamentally dysfunctional, was fundamentally corrupt. So visceral was the frustration with the evils of the 19th century among architects: overcrowding, filth, crime, sanitary degeneration, moral degeneration, all the evils castigated by the socialist utopians, as well as by the bourgeoisie in the 19th century, albeit for, of course, different reasons. So visceral was that institutionalized embattlement of architects against the old, and so heroic was the experience of the firestorms that these architects in the early months of World War II had just undergone, that many of them apparently couldn't help developing a desire even for apocalyptic annihilation, or at least a thorough fascination with the course of history, its grandiose fatality, a fatality that allowed the world spirit to unleash extraordinary powerful energies, to the effect that ultimately the outline of a better new city capable of bringing about salvation could appear on the horizon. And borrowing these terms from Niels Gutschow, the German historian of post-war reconstruction, who knows what he's talking about because his father, Konstantin Gutschow, had been responsible for the reconstruction plans drawn for Hamburg under Hitler and Speer. So his father was one of the urbanists who was sitting in Hamburg, suffering, of course, from the incredible blasts of the Allied attacks in 1943, but at the same time saying, okay, finally, that is our moment. Finally, we'll have the chance to actually build the new city. Now, speaking of Hitler and Speer, we know, thanks to the diaries of Albert Speer, that by 1941-42, Speer and Hitler openly discussed the fact that the bombing of Berlin would alleviate some of the need for extensive demolition, not to mention the displacement of tens of thousands of Berliners after Speer's diaries. I mean, in other words, they agreed, okay, well, if we have to suffer the bombing of Berlin, never mind, that will make it easier for us to build the new Berlin. Now, once the war was over, during the occupation, the attitude of those in power was, not so different, of course, from that typical professional attitude of the urbanists and planners. The more thorough the cities had been bombed, the more likely it appeared that radical urbanists would finally get a chance. The easier to finally eradicate the evils of traditional urbanism. Needless to say that in its form, the new city, as envisioned after 1940-41, immediately after the first months of the war, through the first massive bombardments, and certainly so after 1945, was intended to be built as a suppression of ruin memory, both in its Western European and its Eastern European incarnation. Either be it either as an embodiment of radically modern biotechnical rationality. This is the plan that the French administration had envisioned for the heavily bombed city of Mainz. Needless to say that nothing of it was built because the population did not want a new city like this. There was actually only very few functionalist, post-war projects that saw life. This is the most famous one, still actually extremely successful. Incidentally, Rindelberg in Hamburg, which was made possible because the British administration in Hamburg was able to organize the campaign in a military way once the city had been taken over by Allied forces, and therefore was capable of building a still very impressive example of doing away with ruin memory in terms of urbanism. But the same mechanism obviously is true for what happened in East Germany, where more or less at the same time, maybe a little later, in the late 1940s, beginning 1950s, under the Soviet supervision, neoclassical principles of reconstruction were enacted along a very similar kind of logic of obviously doing away with ruin memory, and that Soviet poster that says, "We want to eliminate all traces of war." That's the text that was written on the poster. Obviously, emblematises this attitude of building the new city in order to help us forget the war. Now, some critics have been amazed about architects of the post-war years and their ruin amnesia, their tendency to forget that there even was something like a war. Anthony Bittler, for instance, argues that in England, architectural discourse had been characterized during decades by what he calls a culture of suppression and conscious self-deceit with respect to the psychological damages of war. Such authors like Colin Rowe, Alan Cahoon, Robert Maxwell, whose writings more or less centered around the very period of war and post-war, despite their own often dramatic war experiences, had nothing to say about the relevance of those memories for architecture. So Bittler argues, remember that Colin Rowe became an architectural historian because he was wounded in a parachute jump, that Banham worked for the Royal Air Force as an engineer during the war, and that Cahoon was wounded as an officer in India. None of them actually wrote about these things or made the war an issue for architectural interpretation. With the exception perhaps of Colin Rowe, because I think Colin Rowe's text on La Tourette, the light cannons and the ruin-like quality of the concrete of La Tourette, I think may be an exception to this rule. But then, of course, we can wonder, why should one ruminate one's war memories when one is confronted with the task of building a whole new world? Indeed, suppression of war memory, self-deceit, perhaps even the implied admission that the solutions brought about by generals and bombers during the war were, after all, not so different from those architects had themselves tried to promote all along. And I'm showing just this title, "Can Our Cities Survive?" is the obvious, is the official documentation that Siam has presented as a checkbook of rules for the reconstruction or the construction of new cities and the reconstruction of old ones, not only in America but worldwide. Now, you remember maybe that ominously, Sir had another title actually for that book, that they finally, perhaps fortunately for the book, he decided not to use, maybe, "Should Our Cities Survive?" Can our cities survive is admittedly a little less ominous, a little less chilling if you think of it in terms of its contemporaneity with the war. I mean, this book was published the year, I think it was published in 1941, the year when the United States entered the scenario of World War II. Now, all that, this enthusiasm of the architects for ruining, building the new, may have been the price that was paid in order to make the system work, to get the machine of architecture and planning running. Remember that the book, as I just said, had this ominous title, and Should Our Cities Survive? Remember also that it had been in connection with his reconnaissance flights at the service of the United States Air Force in southern Italy that Edward J. Loeb became familiar with the scale of the urban renewal that he later came to practice in the United States. He was responsible for the urban renewal in New Haven and later in Boston. That is during the war, from his cockpit position, he learned to think of cities as large campuses on which to paint the future of society, perhaps even the future of mankind. Not to mention, finally, such organizations like the United Nations that ended up creating one of the beacons of international style modernism. Remember, indeed, that the United Nations was founded with the explicit aim to prevent wars from ever happening again in the future. So it is, to a certain degree, only logical that the architecture that has been enacted here, I mean, the archetypal post-World War II office slab is somehow the incarnation of the repression, the suppression of ruined memory. And that, incidentally, brings us, of course, back to Le Corbusier, who has never abandoned his claim to be, after all, the originator of that particular project. Now, that is, of course, not the full story. Because while the rubble was being shuffled away, painters and writers found themselves struggling with the Orphic fascinations of the ruin and the ruined city. This is a painting of 1947, no, actually 1945, by Franz Radziwiłł, recently on display in a show in Berlin in the National Gallery that presented Eastern and Western German reactions to the war. Cinema, the culture of the ruin film, began to decipher not only the melancholy of the ruins, but also their capacity to turn into spaces of resistance against the dictates of bourgeois order, prone to child's play, as well as to the derive of crime and sex, all aspects soon to be discovered by sociology as well. And in fact, by no means all architects confronted with war damage found themselves drawing ideal reconstruction plans, as Marcel Lotz had been for Henselmann in Berlin. And if they did, it was the very experience of immediate emergency that stood behind those plans, as was the case of the Italian architect Lina Bo, later Lina Bo Bardi, who wrote in retrospect. She was also in Milan together with Savigno, incidentally, at the same time, the same situation when Milan was bombed by Allied forces. I saw the world around me only as an immediate reality and not as an abstract literary exercise. So the immediate reality of that experience was something that, of course, did not fail to touch architects. And some architects have indeed found extremely articulate ways of reacting to this reality. And one of them certainly was Alvar Aalto, who came to see ruination in the context of the Finnish War. Finland was invaded by Soviet Russia in the early moments, actually, of World War II, as some of you may remember, or may remember from having heard about in classes or TV shows, I don't know. Anyway, Aalto went out in those villages and came to see ruination as revealing fundamental anthropological attitudes to the habitat. In the first months of the Finnish Winter War, he went out into the former battle zones and observed women who returned to their ruined homes and was struck by their pragmatism that let them reconstruct life by baking bread in the chimneys of their ruined homes. Here you have such a chimney, and in the background actually you have a example of a type of emergency housing that he promoted in the early years of the war. And here you have one of his photographs of a woman baking bread, a few days after returning to her house. So here we have an architect who is profoundly intrigued and interested in what happens, when men and women suddenly find themselves in extremely simple, primitive, poor, and elementary situations. Max Bill too was fascinated by this when he documented, the work, first steps towards coming to terms with the material remains of ruins in Germany. This is Berlin, and to sort of, put those remains of ruined buildings to fruition as premises of some very simple construction. Now, some of these architects became indeed archivists of ruination, such as indeed the same Lina Bobardi just referred to, when in 1943-44, Joe Ponti's premises in Milan, where she worked at the time, were badly hit by bombs, with one result, that she subsequently engaged in drawing an inventory of war damages in Lombardy, an experience that must have left its traces in her subsequent work in Sao Paulo, Salvador de Bahia, other cities in Brazil, where the remains of older industrial or domestic structures, usually left bare in their ruined state, so often served as the basis of their subsequent reuse as cultural sites to be community centers or museums. So also some of you may be familiar with her work that in fact has a lot to do with ruins. Now that is not an image from Milan, bombed. The image is from London. But I wonder if this kind of experience, which is exactly the kind of experience that Lina Bobardi shared in Milan and that she actually documented, put together as an inventory of bomb damages in Milan, had not something to do with some of her subsequent work. This is obviously one of the best known of her works, Sesc Pompeii, kind of community center, sports facilities, actually gymnasiums stacked, 5 gymnasiums stacked on top of each other. I'm very intrigued by the form of these bullet holes here that she uses in the early 1970s, as if some kind of a memory, a war memory that would have come back. But of course, it's a war memory that may have as much to do with memories or awareness of contemporary art, knowing, of course, that to hurt, to stain, to scratch have been extremely powerful human impulses, and that art has been and is one of the vehicles by which such impulses have become plastic reality. This happens to be a painting of the 1920s, and the first drip painting, if you will, by Francis Picabia. This happens to be a cut through canvas by the Italian painter, artist Lucio Fontana, with whose work I suspect Lina Bobardi may have been familiar. Now, works that, of course, remind us that shooting has always something to do with seeing, as Paul Virilio and others have reminded us in their books. Now, whatever the war memories may have been in connection with the work of Lina Bobardi, I think they have a lot to do with contemporary art, or her interest in certain phenomena in contemporary art may have been triggered by the vitality of her war experience. In any case, it is an intriguing kind of network of factors that may have played a role. Now, at this point, a somewhat more in-depth examination of some case histories would be in order. The Golden Lane housing project by the Smithsons would have to be mentioned, 1952, where the panorama photograph of the ruins of the area of London that was here to be reconstructed, the area of Golden Lane, which is now occupied by Barbican Estate, as you may know. Where this panorama photograph not only serves to exactly identify the site, but to personalize it as part of the events the city and its inhabitants have gone through during the war, like the images of Gerard Philippe and Prime Minister Nero, that, if I can show them, if you don't see them, because there was at some point a pointer, maybe I didn't put it in my pocket, but anyway, you may be able to find, you may be able to spot, I'm here, actually, Nero is greeting from a balcony up there, and this is of course Gerard Philippe, one of the stars of French movies in 1950. So it is as if this ruin scenery, would serve to connect the sensibility of people both with the everyday experience as transmitted, thank you so much, transmitted by movies and by politics. Nero was regarded by progressive left-wingers in Britain as being a representative of the neutral camp, the neutralist camp after the Bandung conference and so on. So a left-wing, an important left-wing voice in the world stage that was not communist, that was not Stalinist. So all that is quite intriguing, and the fact is extremely intriguing that the presence of the ruin is so forceful as an element of this design, as you can see here in this view of the Golden Lane project. And then, of course, this connection with Richard Hamilton, arguably the first pop artist, who again, speaking of Nero, in this case chooses the face of Tito, Marshal Tito, to remind us of the fundamental givens of taste, of smell, of look, of audition, of the necessity to rely on our senses as opposed to relying on dogma and doctrine and political slogans, etc. All that is quite intriguing, and we'll find a sort of a result, obviously, in this strange installation, 1956, Smithson's exhibition piece, the first important exhibition piece by the Smithsons, Patio and Pavilion, built in connection with the This Is Tomorrow exhibition in Whitechapel Gallery in London, 1956. A simple wooden structure resembling an East End garden shed furnished with bits of homely junk, as I think Bannon said. The whole thing like excavated after the nuclear holocaust, again, Rena Bannon. So we see that on the one hand, 52 with the Smithsons, it's World War II is extremely present. It was as a framework for the conception of that reconstruction plan. And in 1957, it's the nuclear holocaust, the threat of the nuclear holocaust that is the basic issue, the theme behind an installation like this. You know, of course, these beautiful images of the pavilion, with actually Peter Smithson even standing, taking the photograph visible in the background. And most intriguingly, the other installation that the Smithsons did the same year, the House of the Future, which I only show the this schematic view is of course nothing else but the opposite of that shed that was left open to the nuclear holocaust. It is some kind of a survival kit of the most essential domestic functions put into a box so as to allow humanity to survive that possible and perhaps inevitable, as it may look, 1956 nuclear holocaust. Now, what I find intriguing is that this presence of war was so obvious, not only in the work of the Smithsons, but in the work of so many architects in the 1960s even and 70s, such as the Venturis. This insistence of the chimney as being the life-supporting kind of instance of the house, which obviously is a theme that goes back to Dwight and has profound, romantic implications for the American architectural consciousness. But I find it intriguing that there's this photograph that you may have seen of Bob Venturi in connection with the excursions, actually not an excursion, but a study trip of the Yale class of 1968 to Las Vegas, that he had himself photographed in front of the chimney, very much like Alto, that he couldn't have known about Alto, his interest in the ruined chimney. And then, we see even Denise, of course, exactly looking at us, which is intriguingly exactly in front of the same chimney. So the presence of the ruin, the presence of the trans-science of architecture as a theme, as a preoccupation, in the midst of Las Vegas, I find it extremely intriguing. And of course, is that my phone? My phone is in your office. Are you sure it's in your office? Okay, so now what is perhaps even more intriguing, being in Houston, the city where, after all, Philip Johnson made some of his important work, that he always said that, the sanitary box, that is the core of the building, has to do with the memory of him traveling with some German troops, immediately after the invasion by the Nazi troops, the invasion of Warsaw, of Poland, and that he has seen some villages where the houses, where only some chimneys of the houses had survived, and that his, determination to have this cylinder, this closed block as a center of his glass house had something to do with this memory. I find this extremely eerie, quite apart from the political implications of all that. Now comes a chapter that I'm afraid I will have to skip, or will really only be very, very brief, namely Stalin. Why Stalin? Because I do think that another great ghost, of brutalism is, of course, the obsession of the British, and the obsession, in particular, also of Rena Banham with communism. And in fact, what strikes one if one reads Banham's book, that Rena Banham wrote the first important book about brutalism, based on an article of 1955, and the book appeared in 1970. He makes a point of the sad situation in which British architecture finds itself, confronted with what he calls, or seems to see as something like a communist threat. Quote, conscious attempts by architects committed to the communist line to create an English equivalent of the socialist realist architecture proposed in Russia by Stahnov's architectural supporters, or rather, so Banham continues, their attempts to enforce an Anglo-Stahnov line conducted with a grotesque mixture of Stalinist comparational techniques and the traditional methods of British snobbery. Finally, actually, when I reread this part of Banham's text, I was extremely intrigued. What could he have had in mind? Obviously, Stalinist architecture like this. This is a beautiful palace by Sholtovsky, I think built in 1947 in Moscow. You would have found these things in London. You find them in London, but they're not Stalinist, they're not socialist realists. It's official imperial British architecture, Commonwealth, 1930s. So I don't really see the threat from this kind, but what he saw was the threat of this sort. He saw the threat from the side of one of his colleagues, James Richards, who wrote this book, Castles on the Ground, which is an attempt at inviting architects to look into the reality of the daily environment of the working people in Britain and see that, in fact, the environment of these, suburban garden cities, perhaps even as poor and as minimal as they may be, had certain qualities and emotional kind of values to those people, to the so-called man from the street, which is an instance quite often now appealed to, that modern architecture apparently had a hard time in offering. Now, interestingly enough, Siegfried Gideon, General Secretary of the International Conferences of Modern Architecture, wrote a review, very favorable review of that book, saying that we architects should, be open for the challenge of this kind of reality, not because we should agree that people have a good taste or that we should, be able to offer them this kind of environment, but we should respect that people have needs that apparently modern architecture is not easily able to fulfill. In any case, Banham was at odds with this particular position. He was at odds with New Empiricism. In fact, that he called the book New Brutalism was, of course, very frontally implying that he was against New Empiricism. New Empiricism is that sort of celebration of prettiness in architecture that British architects were fond of, and that was seen by Banham as a communist threat. Now, one wonders, of course, what then would be the appropriate reference for architecture in a world of social chaos, of ruins, and in a world in the prospect of nuclear annihilation. And now for Banham's generation, for the generation of the brutalists, the answer, as it turns out, could only be Le Corbusier, Mies, or, incidentally, Philip Johnson. The Miesian Johnson, of course, because not yet Houston Johnson, the Miesian Johnson of the glass house. The Johnson where he was still similar to the Farnsworth house by Mies, which was, of course, one of the authoritarian figures in Banham's anti-new empiricist agenda of the 1950s. And here we have him, Mies van Rohe, standing in front of his of the construction site of here, of course, the Unité d'Habitation. And because this is so, the angry young men of British architecture had no choice but to invade the 1951 Siam Congress in Hoddesdon in order to sit at the feet of the grand maître whose views they could respect, as Banham said, whereas the English seniors, whom they more and more despised, went on indulging in endless discussions on the relevance or not of the picturesque tradition for contemporary architecture, something that Banham, as you understand, find utterly uninteresting. Now, this whole issue of the communist threat is, of course, very intriguing. It's actually very present in the history of post-war architectural and artistic discourse. It was an issue in Siam. I mentioned Gideon's favorable review of this book by Jimmy Richards. Jimmy Richards was one of the organizers of Siam conference. I think it was Siam in Bridgewater, where this question of the taste of the man from the street should be put on the table, which was a very hot question because indeed, I mean, socialist realism was, as Banham correctly saw, promoted by, the Eastern European participants of the International Congresses of Modern Architecture, one of them being Helena Circus. Helena Circus, a communist who was actually vice president of Siam, made vice president of Siam at that meeting in Bridgewater. So she was among those who brought, the socialist realist discourse into Siam and created a considerable amount of embarrassment in this connection. This is a conference that she helped co-organize in 1948 in Poland. This is the 49 Bergamo conference, that brought her again in contact with her Western friends and partners. Here we see her sitting at the table. It is again here that she promoted. Actually, she was assisted by some of left-wing colleagues, Hans Schmidt being one of them, who was totally unhappy with the politics of Siam at that point in history. She had written a letter to Gideon suggesting you should read this and that essay by Stalin in order to understand what building today is about. In fact, we propose that at this conference, Siam is no longer called International Congresses of Modern Architecture, but International Congresses of Social Architecture. So, I mean, the confrontation was pretty harsh, especially also on aesthetic issues. Here we see the participants: Gideon, Sert, Corbusier, Ernesto Rogers, and Rudolf Steiner during a break. I actually think this break must have taken place before the talk of Elena Circus, because they're all so relaxed. I think they were much less relaxed after the talk she gave. Now, my final thing is, of course, now Corbusier and Unité d'Habitation, the artistic term. Let's not forget that brutalism as a term is borrowed from art brut. My key witness in this connection is this photograph, which is indeed an extremely intriguing photograph. Corbusier showing Picasso on the site of the Unité d'Habitation. And the funny thing is, you know that this picture was chosen by Corbusier as the frontispiece of, I think it is the 5th or the 6th volume of the Œuvre Complète, where he presents himself as this new figure who is deeply involved in the discussion with contemporary art, as opposed to be the technocrat of, social redemption via rationalist urbanism. So he places this photograph as a frontispiece of this post-war volume of Œuvre Complète. And what I find intriguing is that he's not actually the protagonist of this photograph. The protagonist is clearly Picasso, who is standing with his royal profile, extravagantly lit, juxtaposed to the black background of the pilotis, whereas in the foreground we have actually Bernhard Hösli, who was a little later becoming a Texas Ranger before he then was recycled as a professor at the School of Architecture at the ETH Zurich. He was actually my first professor in Zurich, who was, eagerly watching how his boss, Le Corbusier, passes the exam that he is, he has to deliver in front of the very master of modern art. Now, the challenge of socialist realism. What is socialist realism? Well, it's an architectural position that declares architecture to be an art, that declares architecture to be based on the dialogue with painting and sculpture. Now, what is Corbusier? It is exactly the same. In a certain sense, modernism with the Unité d'Habitation, with Le Corbusier, makes one step in the direction of a theory of art that incorporates painting and sculpture within the system, and architecture within the same system of the arts. And paradoxically, of course, the younger generation did exactly the same thing. The younger generation around Green Abandon, the independent movement in England, Hamilton and others, who were actually extremely interested in the environment, extremely interested in architecture. They were the ones who had organized the exhibition This Is Tomorrow that I referred to a moment ago, and that obviously responded to some aspects of official modern architecture, but at the same time shared the deep conviction of people like Gideon, like Corbusier, that modern architecture can only survive as modern architecture as being part of a system that incorporates also painting and sculpture. As far as Hamilton is concerned, you know, of course, this very famous collage. I do think that he was more than just barely familiar with what we're talking about, namely Corbusier, because I do think that his famous, what is it that makes our home so beautiful, so attractive, has more than just faint memories of modern architecture. Now, I don't want to go in detail into details of Le Corbusier's ruins, except for reminding you that Corbusier's formation, you know, took place via ruins, via the sites of ruins. From text to Istanbul, he actually witnessed a fire in Istanbul that ruined part of the old city of Istanbul. Here we have Pompeii. Here we have Paris, that he wanted to see transformed into a kind of a ruin site. Here we have his affirmations that indeed one demolishes, yes indeed, one demolishes every day. What is important is that one demolishes well and firmly and following a healthy program. All these famous utterances that obviously take an eerie kind of implication if you think they were made in 1933, 34, that a few years later part of Europe were in fact massively, demolished. Now this is a photograph that he shows in La Ville Radieuse, 1934, with exactly the quote that I just made. This one is perhaps even more dramatic, where he says, we do not preserve our corpses. Why should we preserve the corpses of our cities? Let's not, let's send them to the cemetery. Let's build new cities. And paradoxically enough, or perhaps not paradoxically, his new city was a city destined to make ruins impossible in the future, because of course, we know better after 9/11, he argued that the Ville Radieuse would be difficult to hit by bombs, because bombs would have a hard time to find those slabs. So it would be a much safer way that would make ruins actually impossible in the future. Post-war, when he was engaged, actually proposed plans for the rebuilding of the city of Saint-Dié. He came to Saint-Dié, was fantastically inspired, of course, by the site, also absolutely full of admiration for the way the cleaning of the site, of the rubble and of the ruins, finally made it possible for man, he spoke more of men than of women, for man to experience the landscape around it. But then there was also another side to him, because as is most often the case with Corbusier, when he says one thing, he thinks the other thing. When he thinks something, he does a third thing. So in actual fact, he was confronted with ruins. He did, in fact, speculate as an architect on what happens when buildings crumble, what happens, what is needed when we have first aid kind of emergency situations, and as architects have to confront them. He built a little book that some of you may know of very primitive means by which to reconstruct, or actually to construct youth centers in war-damaged zones of France. And since he was such an admirer of Picasso, he knew, of course, also of Picasso's Guernica, and he knew of art's capacity to commemorate in a melancholic way the drama of war and the drama of ruins as they are experienced by the inhabitants, by the victims of war and bombing attacks. So in a later moment of the planning of Saint-Dié, once he had decided to erect a totally new city, Ville Radieuse, on the basis of the totally raised surface of Saint-Dié. He also said that we might actually preserve part of the cathedral. We might turn it into a war memorial, make it into a site of commemoration of the war. And he made some drawings that proposed some kind of a cube, reinforced concrete with glass envelope that would be sunken into the cathedral and to make it into a war memorial. This is what actually survived of the cathedral after World War II. Now, what is intriguing is that this proposal is made at a moment when it had already become clear that the rebuilding plan of Saint-Dié would not be materialized. When he thought that at least I might, be able to activate, the office in sort of being involved in doing a war memorial. In doing so, he may have known, but it's not so probable that he must have known of similar initiatives in England, who immediately after the first attacks on the Blitz had proposed to preserve some of the worst hit churches of London. He certainly did not know, of course, this is now one of these beautiful sketches by Corbusier of this. This is really a project, it's just a couple of sketches. He cannot have known of this drawing by Louis Kahn that was done before the sketch that Corbusier done. This is a drawing done in 1944 for an article on the new monumentality by Louis Kahn, never published. Actually, the photograph exists only, the drawing exists only as a photograph in the archives of the Museum of Modern Art. And in fact, in a certain sense, if you think of Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche in Berlin, you could argue that the new monumentality has become a reality in post-war European urbanism, specifically and most successfully perhaps in contexts where where ruins had been made into war memorials, such as is definitely the case with the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche in Berlin, which came in the mid-1950s, so something like 7 years after Corbusier's proposal for Saint-Dié. And it's intriguing that in Berlin too, the first idea had been to demolish, of course, the ruin and to develop, to create a totally new church. This is the first project by Egon Eiermann. Then the people, protested, were not happy with this proposal, and what was finally built was a compromise that was the one that we still see when we visit Berlin, and that became a pole of attraction, and interestingly enough, a place that was invested by considerable political momentum, especially once the wall began to be built, which happened at the time exactly when that slab building here was growing, which was the first large hotel slab built in post-war Berlin, the Hotel Europa, the Europa Center, that for certainly 5 or 6 years, if not an entire decade, made Breitscheidplatz, or this whole area, into the beacon of the free world in the image economy of post-war Germany. And this brings us, of course, back again to Corbusier. This is the church. Now, Corbusier, after the war, this is his best-known post-war work. This is the chapel of Ronchamp. He did build war monuments, and Ronchamp is a war monument. He did propose, in certain cases, just the preservation of a given ruin, such as for this small bergerie, sort of a hospice for pilgrims in a pilgrimage sanctuary south of France. When he arrived at the site of Ronchamp, he decided that the new church will be built from the rubble of the existing church. These are the beautiful photographs that were taken of the construction site, which indeed is an example of ruin in reverse, although one has to admit that the final looks of the chapel doesn't really transport this feeling, because as we all know, the chapel was finally ended up being entirely white. And now the unité d'habitation, which I started, which in certain ways I think can be reinterpreted in terms of these criteria that I was trying to sketch. The top, with the heavily sculptural character of these structures here in the roof garden of the Unité d'Habitation, very intriguing use of concrete. You remember that Lucio Costa, when he visited the construction site of Unité d'Habitation, was horrified. He said, well, it should never use concrete for the monumentality of its mass. The only way of using concrete is to use concrete economically, namely reducing the material to the utmost so as to achieve with a minimum of material use a maximum of structural effect. The idea that he had in mind was, of course, the Ministry of Education in Brazil, in whose planning, incidentally, obviously had a certain share. And what we have here is, of course, something quite different. This is the opposite. This is a sculptural treatment of concrete, not the economic treatment of functionalism in the 1920s and 30s. And it's cultural in a very literal sense, because otherwise you would not explain or would not understand why this funny exhaust kind of chimney needs to be posited on a base like this. It needs to be posited on a base because Corbusier himself was doing sculpture that was placed on bases very much like this. This is some of his work. We find in the thing. This also is, of course, a kind of a sculptural invention that reminds of his sculptural work, and at the same time, those of you who've been up here remember when one steps out of the elevator, immediately one has the sight of the horizon, one sees the sea, then one steps down 2 steps and doesn't see anyone, at least if you have a normal size like me. If you're taller, then it doesn't work. For Corbusier, it did work if you compare his modular size. When you are here, this is about your size. You don't see outside, so you have to turn back, have to look up and see those forms and have the feeling that if you were able to go up there you would have a fantastic view of the horizon and of the sea. Indeed, behind this is the archetype of the Villa Bestegui, the Bestegui penthouse with its quasi-surrealist implications and associations here with Magritte. And I hear that there's an exhibition of Magritte in Houston right now. I think Magritte has a lot to do with early Corbu, and so has certainly the Pictura Metafisica, Morandi in this particular case, not to mention, of course, Giorgio de Chirico, who sort of, Corbusier seems to be ruminating as part of 20th century art history when he is building this incredible landscape. And I think he goes even further back. He even sees personifications in some of these forms of the chimneys on the roof that brings back to the kind of symbolist evocations of classical antiquity that you find in some paintings of the late 19th century, like Buckley. And here, of course, you have the explicit ruin on the rooftop of the Unité d'Habitation that very directly reaches back to Verin Architecture, which among its 150 illustrations has something like 29 or 30 images of the Acropolis, so it's a book to a certain degree about ruins. And you could argue that with all this, the Unité d'Habitation also transports and transforms memories of war. Not as explicitly as the project by the Smithsons of roughly the same time, 52, who London has done, remember that Marseille too was hit by war. Marseille too was hit actually by Allied bombings at the very end of World War II. So when Corbusier says that Unité d'Habitation was built on the basis of a battlefield, he meant actually his personal battle that he had to fight against the profession. But in fact, Marseille was a battlefield, very much in the sense London was, and some of its poetry reverberates with the kind of more melancholy or Holocaust, nuclear Holocaust anxiety of the work of the Smithsons. And I do find it extremely interesting and intriguing that it was precisely in Unité d'Habitation that Corbusier decided that, okay, I will allow photographs to be taken on the construction site. That he allowed Lucien Hervé to come and make pictures of the construction site, accepting actually even the beauty, the drama of the construction site as being expressive of the tragedy of architecture that he wanted to see inscribed in this building, that he obviously saw as also not only incorporating tragedy and war memory, and here of course I'm referring to Charles James, Vincent Scully, and many people, and including Bannon, who wrote about this aspect, but also salvation from war and from disaster. And in fact, the primeval symbol of salvation is, of course, the ark, is the boat, is Noah's Ark, or the modern form of Noah's Ark, the ocean liner, that is the archetype behind the concept of the Unité d'Habitation, as you could argue, and we know what the tragedies and what the burdens of memory also are that humanity needed to be saved from with this icon of salvation. So these are a few speculative attempts at coming to terms with this monster, Le Corbusier, that has been on my mind for a while. Sorry to have been much too long.
We have time for a couple questions, if there are questions from the audience.
Please. What do you think in your thinking between the characterization that ruins embody the sense of sort of melancholic loss of past and at the same time future in the making? I wonder if that, how you see that apply to the American context. I know you mentioned Robert Smithson at the same, but do you see that sort of working the same way as the European history kind of forms meaning around it, or is it different?
Well, very glad you asked this question, but I don't have a very clear answer to that. I don't think anybody has, but I've read a book which I find is an absolutely fantastically inspiring book, which actually I should have mentioned. I owe a lot of inspiration to the book. It's a book by Emmanuel Rubio, a French author, and unfortunately I don't think it's likely that this book will ever, or in the near future, be translated into English, because it is not at all the kind of things that peer review, the peer review mechanism encourages. It's a rather journalistically written book on the title Architecture Cathartique, cathartic architecture. And he argues, he's very well informed about American architecture in the 1960s and 70s, and he argues that there was a thorough militarization of architectural culture, and urbanistic culture in the 1950s and 60s in the United States. And he actually refers also to Edward Law, whom I was referring to, these people who came right from the experience of World War II to do urban renewal, to reconstruct American cities. Incidentally, the first urban deconstructions almost contemporary to the ruination of Rotterdam and London was actually Robert Moos' beginning of the planning of certain parts of New York. So he says that in urbanism, in the urbanistic culture of the United States in the 50s and 60s, way into the 70s, there was a kind of implicit militarization that had taken place. The demilitarization, of course, that was the reaction to this. And he said that in the architecture of American architecture, I've just seen, a building by Ulrich Franzen 2 hours ago, across the street, not too far from here. In any case, at Yale, obviously, we're sitting in a bunker. The art and architecture building is one of the archetypal American brutalist buildings. Now, Emmanuel Rubio says that in a certain sense, the reaction to the militarized habitus of American architecture and planning in terms of architecture was the rediscovery of the bunker. I mean, as an architectural trope that again, had to do with an anxiety of security, which is very much profound, obviously, theme of the Cold War, perhaps more than World War II. So that is the answer. Now, Ross sketched that Rubio, who has done a lot of thinking about these things, proposes. I don't really know if I want to follow him in detail, but there has been thinking about this.
I have a kind of ill-formed question, and slightly a comment. I'm thinking about the very elegant way in which you introduce a much more compelling version of ruin as a notion. And I'm thinking of it as somebody living in the present, and the fact that ruin today means something very different. I'm not sure that actually the notion of war ruin, for example, finds the same kind of traction today simply because we're somewhat estranged from that kind of destruction. On the other hand, I'm thinking also of another kind of ruin, and I'm not sure there I'm applying it correctly, that has to do simply with the way we dispose of architecture today, that there is a kind of ephemerality about it which isn't necessarily positive, or disposability. And I'm wondering if you have pondered that, and that's why I don't know that the question is fair, because I'm not sure I want to oblige you to step into the present. But I'm struck by the generosity of your definition of ruin, and whether or not that might find another kind of value in the present.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I showed you this title page of yesterday's New York Times. So, I mean, we are surrounded by war ruins. I mean, war ruins are a daily, not obviously, fortunately, on this continent, not a daily experience, but definitely a daily experience for many people. And also, obviously, a concern, to put it very positively, I could also say a particular fascination on the side of the media. I mean, the media are absolutely obsessed with ruins. I mean, why would the New York Times, I would say, really 1 out of 3 days, has a ruin, a war ruin in this particular case, on its front page. Now, obviously, in an era where you have ruination of entire cities, speaking of Detroit, for instance, there was a disappearing city. That is a different phenomenon, and I do not want to link this, I would say, pretty much late 20th century or early 21st century phenomenon with brutalism. I mean, this was a clumsy attempt at sort of coming to terms with the phenomenon of historicized aspects of brutalism that have not been historicized properly, as I think. But I think the very fact that you describe in the presence of a certain type of, edifice that is no longer actually a permanent building that we are confronted with as being given, that very fact that this is so prominent today, I mean, maybe triggers me to look into that particular aspect in architectural history of the late 20th century. But I do not have, I'm not equipped to go further along the line that you have already outlined. Please.
In that case, would you say that the Pavillon d'Esprit Nouveau 1925 is a ruin. It has a tree that grows inside it.
I never thought of this.
Much like Angkor Wat, or the images of Angkor Wat were circulating at the time with the huge ficus trees growing inside of buildings and coming out of the roof or something like that. So in other words, can one suddenly discover ruins in places where they're not supposed to be, like the Estine Nouveau?
Well, the thing is, it surprises me that I never thought of this, to see Les Pavillons des Nouveau as a ruin because of that roof. Well, yes, I mean, this is a rather sort of generous definition, even more generous than my definition of ruins, to include the Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau, because the Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau, I mean, is part of an aggressively, pacifist and pacifying agenda towards building a new city that would really dispose of the visible traces of a past, be it in form of ruins or of surviving buildings. So this was a part of an architectural system that was determined, that was destined to substitute an existing urban reality. So I find it, as much as I'm delighted by your idea that piercing tree, creating that hole has something to do with a ruin. The concept of the Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau is the opposite of a ruin. It's really the answer to a society and a city that the architect thought was in a condition of spiritual and intellectual ruin and needed to be entirely rethought. I think that was basically the agenda.
I was struck at the end to see those pictures that were taken of Le Corbusier's work under construction, which is something that, as far as I know from people like Ernst Scheidegger, was something he never permitted, right? Something that was not part of his own either, like showing something that's in a kind of not finished state. So were those pictures published, or did he just permit them and then sort of shuffle them under the table?
No. Well, you're making absolutely that I'm trying to make also, try to a certain degree also to make a connection with the publication on Scheidegger's beautiful, ruin in reverse photographs of Chandigarh as a construction site. He made actually a layout project for a book of his very beautiful photographs. And the publisher, Giersberger, who is the publisher of the Œuvre Complète, more or less was interested in producing that book, but probably, called on Corbusier or asked Corbusier in one of his visits to Zurich, do you think it's a good idea to have that done? And Corbusier must have said, no way, I don't want it. It's not a subject that is of relevance to see the construction site. And as a matter of fact, the Fondation de Corbusier has an incredible wealth of construction site shots of Chandigarh that are still unpublished. There is incredible jobs still to be done on actually the building history of the assembly building, because you have hundreds, but certainly dozens of construction shots that were never published. And he did allow some construction shots by Hervé, who went to the sites of the Unité d'Habitation to have them published in some places. I don't think that Unité d'Habitation in the Œuvre Complète is documented in construction shops. I don't think so. Strangely, there are some 1920s buildings like the Cité de Refuge, where some construction shots are being shown, because only in such a way can you present the principle of reinforced concrete that is being used. But you are making an important point, and I find this slight inflection on Corbusier's side in connection with the construction site of the Unité d'Habitation. Okay, maybe it is after all an interesting aspect of the building to see how it grows. I find this an interesting acknowledgement of the aesthetic of the ruin implicit in the construction site from this side.
Last question, Sam.
Following up on that, I
had a question about concrete, which kind of thinking in this, but it occurred to me that concrete is an architectural material whose construction is incredibly unlike its ruination, in the sense that when it's formed, it moves from a liquid to a solid, it takes its form suddenly, and it retains the imprint of its formwork, whereas the ruination of concrete might occur either catastrophically through some event or very, very gradually. So I'm wondering whether concrete could be a ruin in reverse, in the sense of your first chapter where there's a complete ambiguity between the making and unmaking of the work, or whether you see the casting of concrete as perhaps the first step of ruination.
I wish I were Emmanuel Rubio, because Rubio has a long chapter on precisely that question, which I think is an extremely interesting question, but I haven't really thought much in that direction, because there's no because. So I apologize for that. I haven't given it that much thought. But you're right. If you're looking at those, details of the painting by Bruegel, it's almost like concrete being cast, or in the process of sort of gaining form. So actually, obviously there's concrete and concrete. I find there's a Roman concrete, and then in a certain sense you could probably argue that Corbusier's use of concrete in the d'habitation comes pretty close to the Roman use of concrete as mass, which is exactly the kind of thing that people like Lucio Costa or rationalists, or of course functionalists in the 1920s and 30s would have absolutely wanted to see avoided. Then there's this other issue. I mean, do concrete buildings, produce interesting ruins? I mean, in a certain sense, they don't. I mean, they're ugly ruins. I mean, it's actually, I think Gideon even writes a little bit about this in one of his very late books. So, I mean, concrete has a lot of secrets in this connection, and I think you're putting your finger on one that are not elucidated. I don't think except for boring you, I will not bring you your insight much further. But I think you're making an important point.
Thank you for coming.